with us. Y'all were seeing, how it's going down with Zoom and everything. Welcome to our financial aid portion of Chat and Chew. Hope y'all have some lunch. My name is Shamel Yamofio. I'm the Director of Counseling at Bishop McNamara High School. I also am one of the senior counselors. I have students at the end of the alphabet with students with last names K through Z. I'm about to make Mr. Burrows a presenter. One moment. Multi-panelists. Okay, and I'll allow Mr. Burrows to introduce himself, but before he does that, this will be shared. Okay, so Mr. Burrows, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, how's everyone doing? My name is Mr. Terry Burrows. I'm the senior counselor for letters, so student last name letters A through J. I've been here for a little bit over a month. I've met a lot of the students and I'm excited to be here. So. And just as a quick introduction, again, thank you guys for joining us. We are joined by two financial aid professionals who will go over many topics that we discussed before on the last Parent Chat and Chew. So we have Carolyn Broadfoot, who is Assistant Director at University of Richmond. We have Ozza Smith, who's a financial aid specialist at McDaniel College. We gave them like different things to talk about, whereas financial aid, just in general. So FAFSA, how the specific schools like handle the financial aid process, any type of scholarships and how to find scholarship opportunities, and then any of the documents that you guys want to go over. And then we'll do that for roughly around like 10 minutes, and then maybe shorter than that, but we'll save the rest of the time for any questions that you guys have. Okay, and we can pass on to Ozza.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so hello everyone. As Terry mentioned, my name is Ozza Smith. I'm one of the financial aid specialists at McDaniel College. So just going to go over just some general financial aid principles and some information you would need to know about scholarships. So first, what is financial aid? So financial aid is funding meant to lower and or cover a student's educational expenses. It can be a combination of grants, scholarships, loans, and work study. It can come from the college the student attends, the federal government, the state that the student is from or lives in, or external sources. And typically it has specific requirements that a student has to meet in order to remain eligible or to renew those awards every year. So the CSS profile and the FAFSA are two applications that colleges can use to assess a student's eligibility for financial aid. The CSS profile is offered through College Board. It may have a fee depending on the family, and it essentially assesses a student's need for non-federal financial aid, which typically ends up being need-based aid from the college that the student is attending. Not all colleges use the CSS profile, so it's important to know whether or not a school that your student is applying to uses it or doesn't, so that you can make sure you get that completed. The FAFSA, on the other hand, is used by a majority of schools. It's offered through studentaid.gov, which is supported by the Department of Education. It's free to use for everyone, regardless of what your income is. And it assesses a student's eligibility for federal grants, loans, and other types of assistance. For example, McDaniel does not use the CSS profile. We use the FAFSA to award both need-based aid and federal aid that a student is eligible for. So when filing the FAFSA, it's important to remember that the FAFSA has to be completed every year, and it opens on October 1st. So I always say it's a good tip to use the fall semester of that year to assess what FAFSA you're going to complete. For example, if a student is starting in August of 2022, then you're going to complete the 2022-2023 FAFSA. The FAFSA is also going to use student and parental information if the student is dependent, and it's always going to use 2-year prior income information. So again, if a student's entering the college fall of 2022, they're doing the 2022-2023 FAFSA, and it's going to ask for 2 years prior tax information, so 2020 tax income information. So this is the general McDaniel financial aid process. Each college varies a little bit, but for McDaniel, essentially, we ask that you complete your admissions application first to make sure you don't miss any admissions deadlines. Then after that, complete the FAFSA, even if you haven't heard back yet from admissions. And you'll see why we do this in a moment. Next, you'll submit any missing documentation that we may need. We'll typically reach out via email and let you know if there's anything, any additional documentation or information we need from you. If you don't need anything, we won't reach out. And then essentially you're then waiting on that admissions packet to come in. You'll get it. It'll have nice packaging. You'll find out that you were admitted. And then after that, within a couple weeks, then you'll receive either your estimated or your final award letter. That's why we ask that you complete the application first and then do the FAFSA, so that you're finding out what financial aid you qualify for shortly after you're admitted to the college. If you receive an estimated award letter, that means there's something we are still missing. If it's a final award letter, that means you aren't missing anything. So some types of federal and state aid a student could be eligible for. First, on the federal side, Pell Grant, that's a big one a lot of people hear about. It's need-based and it's based on the FAFSA. FSEOG, it's like the Pell Grant where it is need-based, but colleges are limited on how much FSEOG that they have to utilize every year, but it is another grant. Federal work study, of course, a lot of people hear about that. Federal work study, a student earns by working, and so they earn their federal work study dollars instead of that getting applied to their bill, but it is federal funds, so the student does not have to pay that back. If a student is a Maryland resident, and if the parent on the FAFSA is a Maryland resident, then the student can qualify for some grants or scholarships through the state of Maryland. Some of the need-based ones are educational assistance grant. That's a common one, $3,000 per year, $1,500 per semester, and it's renewable every year. The guaranteed access grant, that's a larger grant, typically in the range of $18,000 to $20,000 a year. And any school that participates in the guaranteed access program will match the amount given by Maryland. For example, students who were awarded the guaranteed access grant for this year received $19,300 from Maryland, and then they received another $19,300 from McDaniel because McDaniel participates in the program. Some non-need-based awards that Maryland provides are the senatorial and delegate scholarships. Those are going to depend on where the student is located in Maryland, but I'll actually provide you the link on how to find links to those scholarships as well a little later. But those are non-need-based, typically renewable, as long as the student continues to have a 2.0 GPA. There's also some special population and career-oriented grants through Maryland as well, for military families or students who are going to go into a certain career path, and those are also available on the MHEC or Maryland website. On the scholarship side, there are merit scholarships. So these are awarded based on a student's academic achievements. They're typically given by a college or another organization, and they're typically renewable. On the right side of this screen, you'll actually see some of McDaniel's merit and legacy scholarships that students can apply for, that the application is still open right now. Third-party scholarships are through anywhere other than the college, so local foundations, businesses, community centers, places like that. There's also scholarship search engines, kind of like Google, where they just have a whole bunch of them and the student kind of has to enter things in to narrow down the selection process. They can be based on merit, need, or performance. So things like you submit a video, you get the scholarship, or the best essay, things like that. So these are some important websites that you may need to use in your financial aid, through the financial aid process. So first is the FAFSA, studentaid.gov. For students student is a Maryland resident and the parent on the FAFSA is a Maryland resident, then you'll use MHEC or Maryland Higher Education Commission. They provide that information on other types of awards that a student could be eligible for through MHEC. MDCAPS is the awarding system that Maryland uses for Maryland awards. If you have additional questions, I can definitely go into more detail about MDCAPS, but that's another link that students commonly use. And the McDaniel, I'm very proud of it. A project that came out of since I've been at McDaniel is the McDaniel scholarship page. You do not have to be a McDaniel student or a McDaniel applicant to use it. It's just available right on our website. It's a good starting point for a lot of families that don't know kind of where to begin in their scholarship search process. And we add additional ones every year. So it just continues to grow, become more relevant and things like that. And I will stop there and open it up for questions.
Thank you. And for the presentation, I do want to open it up to Carolyn and talk a little bit more about, because University of Richmond does do the CSS profile. So you talk a little bit more about that and then any specific scholarship programs with Richmond as well. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Caroline Broadfoot, and I'm one of the assistant directors here at the University of Richmond. And yes, as Terry mentioned, we do also require the CSS profile in addition to the FAFSA. So, you know, as you just saw, the FAFSA is essentially your application for federal aid. Think of the CSS profile as your application for the institutional need-based aid that we provide. Need-based aid is different, you know, as you just saw, than merit aid. So with the CSS profile, it's asking for a lot of the same information as the FAFSA, but there is a little more to it. So there are going to be a few more questions. It's going to feel a little more arduous than the FAFSA, and unfortunately, it does not have the capabilities because it's not a federal application to for some families who are eligible to be able to pull in from the IRS data retrieval tool. So you will have to manually put it all of your information in, unfortunately. But I just always suggest that families have their tax returns out beside them as they're completing it. And each of the questions will show you, you know, ask what they're asking for, but they'll also have little info buttons you can click on or hover over that will explain exactly where that is on your tax return. So the CSS profile, much like the FAFSA, opens up October 1st or every October 1st as well. So it's open, it's out there, and you're able to submit that. It might take just a little longer than the FAFSA because it's the additional questions it's going to ask for are things like home equity, for example. The FAFSA doesn't ask for that, the CSS profile will. It allows you to report expenses that you have. So if you have, you know, high school expenses for, say, like a private high school, or maybe some other expenses, and then it actually has a special circumstances section as well. So, you know, a lot of colleges and universities understand that income from 2 years prior is not always the most accurate reflection of a family's ability to pay for college, especially if there's been, you know, job loss or a significant loss of income. Maybe something big medical happened, and there were a lot of high medical bills that were paid out of pocket, things like that. The CSS profile does allow you to expand on that to a degree in the application so that you can kind of explain your situation. But I always recommend, in addition to that section, just reaching out to the college or university to let them know what's going on so they can walk you through what that process would look like to see if a reevaluation is warranted. But the CSS profile is due at the same time as the FAFSA for Richmond. So depending on which admission cycle you decide to apply to, that determines your deadline for both the FAFSA and the CSS profile. So if you're applying early action or early decision 1, you need to get your FAFSA and CSS profile submitted to Richmond by November 15th. So the deadline is different than the admissions deadline. And then if you're early decision 2 or regular decision, it's February 1st. And you're going to be submitting, along with the CSS profile, your tax returns from 2 years prior as well. So even though you're reporting all that information in the application, the tax return kind of serves as like a double check for us. So when we're reviewing the applications, we can make sure you didn't put an extra 0 on something, or make sure, you know, taxes paid, U.S. income taxes paid was correct, things like that.
Thank you. We do have a few questions in the chat. I'll start with Asa from McDaniel. So one of the parents wants to know more about the Educators Legacy Scholarship. So can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so the Educators Legacy Scholarship is for children of K through 12 or community college educators who have at least 4 years of current employment. Now, I know some people have complex employment histories where you're like, well, I was 2 years here and 2 years there. Does that count? I can actually put the link in our website to, the link in the chat to the website, which will kind of give you more details. And if you do have a unique situation, definitely admissions can address, like if it's a more complex situation, that's as far as the eligibility for it. So I'll put that in the chat.
Thank you. And then we have another question. it said, does a student receive more funding completing the CSS application versus a FAFSA application?
That's a great question. It's going to depend on the school. As you know, for schools that only require FAFSA, they only require FAFSA for determining eligibility for need-based aid, both federal and institutional. But for schools that do require the CSS profile, yes, I would say is the answer to that question, because Richmond, for example, if a family were to only submit a FAFSA, that they're only going to be eligible for the federal aid that they qualify for. We require the CSS profile and the tax returns to be submitted in addition to the FAFSA for the need-based institutional grant and scholarship. So in the case of Richmond, yes, because the CSS profile does serve as your application for what the institution can provide grant and scholarship wise, but that's not always the case. So for the schools that only require the FAFSA, then that's all they, it wouldn't make a difference either way because they don't require the CSS profile, but in our case, that yes.
Thank you. What other questions do you all have?
See, one was submitted about, is it too late to submit a CSS or FAFSA? No, it's I assume for this upcoming admission application year. So yeah, if you're applying for admission this upcoming fall 2022, as long as, it depends on which admission site, like pool you're applying to for Richmond. That could be different at other schools. If any other schools you're applying to require the CSS profile, there, unfortunately, every school is probably going to have kind of slightly different dates, which just makes it so fun to keep up with. But yeah, if you're applying early action or early decision 1 to U of R, then you need to make sure you get that in by November 15th. That way, if and when you receive your admission decision, we have a financial aid award letter or offer ready for you that can go with your admission decision. There is a little leeway if you don't quite get everything in on time by November 15th. For example, if you're applying to one of those application pools for admission, I just always push people to, because you never want to get penalized for a late application. Some schools might, like if you're submitting things way late, might have hard deadlines to where they just cut off eligibility. So I would really pay attention to those deadlines. And then if you're applying for early decision 2 or regular decision at Richmond, you have till February 1st.
And for McDaniel, we actually don't have a deadline for filing the FAFSA, so you can file it at any time. We send our admissions packet and financial aid packet separately. So you can be admitted and see what scholarships you receive through admissions, and then you receive your financial aid award letter, which is a combination of anything you receive from admissions plus any federal aid that you qualify for as well. Now, if you're eligible for that Maryland aid, so if you're someone in that situation where Maryland resident and parent is a Maryland resident, March 1st is their deadline, but I highly recommend, because it's first come, first serve, that you do it prior to March 1st. I've been telling all my students to do it by the end of January, just to make sure that you're in there and you're not missing out. So.
Thank you. I see another question here. It says, will early application or early decision impact the amount of aid received? I know that typically it's just, again, first come, first serve, especially institutional aid, like it's how much they have. So, but you guys can explain it more if it does impact how much aid is given.
So for us, it doesn't, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, I have my phone working screen.
So for us, it doesn't impact the amount of financial aid you receive. However, if you're a student interested in honors college, or if you've heard of our Dorsey program, which is our full tuition scholarship program, then really the sooner the better. But early decision is kind of your cutoff to be considered for, not necessarily for honors college, but that, everyone always goes for Dorsey first, and then you can still get into honors college without receiving the full tuition scholarship. But but it's so those admissions, those much larger admission scholarships, the presidential awards, honors college, and all of that, early decision could be impacted. But as far as your need-based aid, is not going to affect it. And your federal aid's not going to be impacted by that.
Yeah, for Richmond, it's, whether you apply early decision or early action isn't going to have an impact on the amount of institutional need-based aid or federal aid that you qualify for. That will just be based on the information you submit on those applications. The only date really for Richmond that I would keep in mind for qualifying for a certain thing is if you submit your admission application, no matter which pool you're applying to, so early decision, 1 or 2, early action, or regular decision, as long as you submit your admission application to U of R by December 1st, then you're automatically, all students who submit by that date are automatically considered for our big merit scholarships. Like Richmond Scholars Program, which is full tuition, room and board, and presidential scholarships, which are a third of tuition. So that's really the only, the date in terms of you might miss out on something if you don't get your admission application in by then. But it doesn't matter which decision pool you apply to in terms of need-based aid. And there was another point I was going to make to that. Now I'm escaping me. So. Oh, I'm sorry, I just remembered the point I was going to make. The only thing I would keep in mind between the two different admission decision pools or admission pools, application pools is early decision is binding. You're essentially telling a school like, yes, no matter what, if I get in, I'm going. Like, so I always highly recommend to students, and admissions would say this too, that if financial aid is a big, concern or your decision is going to be based heavily on what you qualify for need-based aid, I would probably apply early action, just because that way you have an out in case things don't pan out the way that you need them to.
Thank you, Caroline. Were you answering Pamela Love's question? I'm just trying to keep up with the questions.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. And so we have another question from Lauren Randall. When submitting transcripts, does the school require proof of enrollment?
For admissions, I assume.
Yeah, Lauren, can you please clarify your question? Lauren asked that in the Q&A section, not necessarily in the chat.
Oh, I was looking at the chat.
Lauren, yeah, can you please clarify your question? Thank you. And then the question from Dr. Pear, for early action, all documents must be received by November 15th or November 1st, correct?
For early action, it's November 15th.
Okay.
Yeah, so you still got a few days.
Okay, good. Another question from Maru in the Q&A. Are the grants from Maryland for Maryland colleges only, or any colleges that the student is admitted to? So that could be for
Yeah, so Maryland is, and this is most states, if you receive Maryland aid, you can only use it at a Maryland college or university. Now I did see that there was a question about DC. So DC CAPS, McDaniel does have students who receive DC CAPS funding, or that's essentially their version of DC's version of state aid for their students. They did allow some students who receive DC CAPS awards to bring those over to McDaniel. So it just depends on the state, and it depends on the award a lot of times too. But for Maryland, you have to go to a Maryland school in order to receive that funding.
Awesome. Someone else asked, if the student is a dependent and has no income, does the student and parent both complete a FAFSA, or can the parent just complete one?
So both. So dependency is always a tricky thing with the FAFSA, and I know we get a lot of questions about it. So when the student's completing their section, there's a section called that says dependency questions or dependency on the FAFSA, and that's used to assess whether or not a student is independent or dependent for financial aid purposes. So with that contingency, not independent or dependent on someone's taxes or to vote or anything like that, but for financial aid or federal financial aid purposes. There are certain requirements a student has to meet in order to be considered independent. And so not earning any income does not, that in itself does not qualify a student to be independent. So take a look at some of those questions. You can actually look them up on studentaid.gov. They'll actually give you the list of all the dependency questions. If a student cannot say yes to one of those questions, then typically they are not considered independent for federal financial aid purposes. Of course, there's appeal avenues for students who don't fit in those categories, but for majority of students, it's if you can't say yes to one of those questions, then you are dependent and you must provide parental information on the FAFSA.
Thank you. I think Lauren did give clarification for Lauren's question. When you are submitting official transcripts to the school, do they also ask for proof of enrollment for your current school, or is the transcript sufficient? And from a school counselor's perspective, the transcript is sufficient. Colleges do not ask for proof of enrollment. See another question in the chat. Is CSS profile like FAFSA in that you complete it and send it to schools you're applying to? Or do you have to complete a separate CSS profile for each school?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is much like the FAFSA. You're going to just complete all the information once and then list the schools that you want to send it to. Some schools might have certain, depending on which schools you're sending it to, might have you complete or require certain pieces that others don't. So for example, you know, some schools that use the CSS profile require that for their application process for need-based aid. Let's say a family doesn't or didn't file taxes 2 years ago. Some schools might require them, and it'll prompt you when you're completing the CSS profile to complete like a non-filer statement that they have. They have their own where you know, state your earnings that you had from whatever, you know, job it was in that year, so that you can confirm what you earn, you sign off on it. And that kind of takes place of the tax return. Richmond, we don't require it, but you'll be prompted to if one of the schools that you listed does require a form like that, for example, you'll be prompted to put that on there.
Thank you. So if a student receives Social Security, is it considered income?
Did you want to take this one?
Either.
I don't want to talk over you.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, yes, it is. You will be reporting that. It will import, like if you use like the data retrieval tool on FAFSA, you know, Social Security, taxable Social Security benefits will import, you know, if you're able to use the IRS's data retrieval tool in your FAFSA. If not, you'll have to manually put it in there. Same thing with the CSS profile. You'll be reporting that. And some schools may, not all, but some schools might ask that you provide the Social Security statement from your taxes that you receive, just to kind of verify the amounts. Not all schools do that, but some might reach out, you know, after your application is submitted as they're reviewing, just to have like request that to verify the amounts that were reported on the CSS profile.
We have another question from Ms. Ronette Myers. We are DC residents. We are eligible for DC TAG. Are there any other scholarships available for DC residents? So I think maybe we can collaborate on this answer. And I know Mr. Burrows probably going to touch on this eventually anyway, but every Monday we send students out a scholarship bulletin, and it's only accessible for students with a BMHS email, but of course they can share it with you, the parents, so you can see the scholarship bulletin that's sent out. There are other DC scholarships that you know, we have we have access to based off of certain websites, but I'll let other folks chime in about any other DC scholarships for DC residents.
So I don't know of too many. I know we do have, there's a couple through DC CAPS, but there's one that I believe is, and I'm sorry, I'm in a room where the light has a timer. But I believe there's a couple that they allow you to take to other schools, but on the DC CAPS website, they have a long list of all their different scholarships. And if you have to go to a DC school in order to receive them, or if you can take them somewhere else, and I can actually probably find that link pretty quickly and put that in the chat for you.
So someone was asking, can you provide the link for general scholarship searches? So I put a few in the chat: goingmary.com, bold.org, scholarships.com. Just be aware of scholarships that say they're sweepstakes. They will get your email address, your child's email address, and send you like 10 emails a day. Sweepstakes where you don't have to submit an essay or anything, just enter. I would be definitely leery of those scholarships. But definitely check out goingmary.com, bold.org, scholarships.com, and a variety of ways and a variety of other sources, going to the college's websites, looking for scholarships that way, local scholarships, churches, fraternities, sororities, and any others that the panelists can chime in on as well.
Yeah, another one I know some students have found helpful is fastweb.com. That's another good resource. Yeah, I always tell them about Going Mary too. It's M-E-R-R-Y.
I'll actually put the McDaniel one in the chat. It includes FastWeb, Going Mary, scholarships.com, but it also has, it's broken out to in-state, so Maryland only. We also have a minority scholarship section as well. It's a good resource to use, and it's just on our website, mcdaniel.edu, search for outside scholarships. It's the first link, and I'll also go ahead and put it in the chat we have as well.
And I also see another question that popped up from Mr. Leslie. I mentioned that you understand that both student and parent will complete the FAFSA. However, each student will need to create a separate profile. So the student actually completes the FAFSA. The parent, I mean, you complete it by putting your information in, but you're not creating a whole nother FAFSA. But if you do have two separate students going to school, then they would need their own FAFSA to go with their own name and application, all that stuff to go separately. But you'll just be, the only thing you're doing is creating a FSA ID, so you can sign both of the FAFSAs. And for you to put your information in as far as like income and assets and things like that. But the student is the person who actually submits under the student name. Did that answer your question, Leslie? Yes, okay.
Didn't want to be redundant with what Aja sent. So I know I thought I had sent it to everyone earlier, but I didn't. It was just panelists. So I'm sending the links again for everyone. But with the combination of all these wonderful links being sent, I would copy and paste away, y'all, before we, start wrapping up. So you'll have this information.
Are there any other questions?
I see the question from Leslie Collier. I'm not sure if that was answered yet. That was?
Yeah, the FAFSA,
okay.
Yeah, that was about the student, they'll complete it.
Great. Any other questions this afternoon?
I did want to add one piece about outside scholarships. Keep in mind that your student is competing with a lot of other students for these awards, both from colleges and from outside sources. So use things about the student, especially if it asks for an essay, or explain why you think you're the best person for this scholarship. Use things that are unique about the student, things they've been through, things they participated in, awards they've received to make them stand out. Also, as far as scholarships, the more the merrier. The more you apply for, the greater, like lottery tickets, right? The more I put in there, the more likely I am to win. And so just keep that in mind. Also, don't ignore the little ones. So I know the 20,000, 25,000 are really attractive. They're also highly competitive. So that doesn't mean your student won't receive them. Still go ahead and do the application, but don't ignore that 1,000, 2,000. Majority of our students who receive outside scholarships, I have a student who, I mean, she had like 10, right? But it wasn't 10 $10,000 scholarships. It was 10, 1,000, 1,500, one that's 2,000. So don't ignore those smaller ones because they add up. And in some cases, your student is more likely to receive those smaller ones from those community centers or churches or other organizations than they are to receive those really big national ones. So those are just my tips for when you're looking for outside scholarships.
And if I could add on that, at least specific to Richmond. So I always encourage just, as you did just now, students to apply to as many scholarships as possible. I will say at Richmond, so we're very fortunate to be able to award and meet 100% of a student's demonstrated need with grants and scholarships. And normally it's with a capped self-help amount. So when you see self-help, that's essentially what the student qualifies for on the federal side of things, how they can help themselves, I guess is how to think of it. So it's, the federal student loans and federal work study. So when students bring in outside scholarships with them to Richmond, that's going to replace the self-help in the calculation for eligibility for institutional need-based aid. So in their first year, they'll see a benefit of the outside scholarships up to $5,000 because that's what the self-help amount is capped at when we're determining eligibility for need-based aid. And then $6,000 in the sophomore year, $7,000 in junior and senior years. That's a bit unusual though, when you compared to other schools. I just thought it would be worth mentioning. A lot of other schools you can stack them up, the more the merrier. So it's still worth going out and applying to as many as you can.
Thank you. There were a few more questions that actually came in as we were wrapping up. Is there a process for stacking scholarships when applying? Meaning, will you be able to use one and not the other if awarded?
So for McDaniel, it's going to depend on what scholarships you're talking about. So for institutional scholarships, we don't stack. If you receive a merit scholarship, then it's a merit scholarship. If you receive a legacy, then it's a legacy. And if you're eligible for both, you have to choose. Now, as far as outside scholarships, we will allow you to stack them as you choose, as long as they're awarded to the student within that award year that they're designated for, and that we're not violating any type of requirements that the scholarship organization has given us. So some will say the student cannot get a refund of this. Then that means if the student already has enough scholarships where they would get a refund if I added it, then we may have to return the funds. Now in a situation like that, if there are loan funds we can reduce or something like that, then we will replace loan funds with scholarship funds. That's our policy, is if we have to reduce a student's aid, we will reduce loans first before we ever send anything back. But yeah, for outside scholarships, we're allowing students to stack up to their cost of attendance to attend the school. We've had many students do that who have scholarships like that where they're stacked and will have to reduce federal loans, which is great, right? We don't want the loans. So that's normally our policy, but like I said, as long as we're within those requirements that the organization gives us, then we'll continue to allow students to stack outside scholarships, but the merit and the ones the student are awarded through the admissions process, those are not stacked. And you'll see that admissions will only award one or the other.
Yeah, I can kind of maybe build on that for Richmond too. It's very similar in the sense that we have to, by like federal regulation, hold students to their cost of attendance for the year. So that's why you'll only like feel the benefit of an outside scholarship up to $5,000 in the first year, because anything that exceeds that is already being met by institutional grants and scholarships, whether that's a combination of merit-based and need-based, or maybe it's only need-based. So that's why, because we're already meeting up to that amount anyway. So I saw there's a question about, will Richmond hold the scholarship for following years if it's more than 5,000? We can't hold on. That's probably a better question for the organization from whom you received the scholarship, because you could possibly ask, or maybe, I don't know if it depends on where it's coming from. Like, could you reapply? Do you have to reapply the next year? Could they hold it for the following year? If it's $5,000, I mean, that's $5,000 you'll, feel the benefit of, because it's replacing self-help, which is that loan eligibility. And but if it's a $6,000 scholarship, that $1,000 that you receive that's exceeding that capped self-help amount in the calculation will just essentially reduce the university need-based grant by $1,000. But you'll feel the benefit of that $6,000 in your sophomore year, because the self-help amount increases. So we can't necessarily hold on to a scholarship for the following year. That's probably a better question for the organization.
Thank you. And then we have a couple more questions there. I just want to ask about financial aid and the time frame around it, like when they typically receive their financial aid package, and then can they ask for additional funding?
So that will vary by school, but as far as us for timeline, it really depends on when you filed your FAFSA, but your admission decision is normally, as long as everything's been turned in and things like that, normally within a fairly short period of time, sometimes as quickly as a week to 2 weeks. It just depends on how many applications we currently have and things like that. So that's pretty quick. As far as financial aid, if a student has already been admitted to the college and they've already done their FAFSA, then because we're at the beginning of the cycle, there's always that like starting point where a school really kicks off starting to send financial aid award letters. So McDaniel will start sending those within the next couple of weeks. So probably prior to Thanksgiving break or shortly thereafter. But after we start sending financial aid award letters, if you've done your FAFSA, you're getting an estimated or a final, usually within a week, at most 2 weeks after your admit decision, but it's a fairly quick turnaround process, especially if you've done the FAFSA right after your application. As far as asking for additional funding, that gets a little more complex because we have sort of two processes with that. But on the financial aid side, we can do what's called a professional judgment appeal. So that's where essentially you're saying the information I reported on the FAFSA is no longer accurate from my current situation because something's happened, right? So say in 2020, you had a job that you no longer have, or someone has passed away since 2020 or something like that, where the information you reported is not your current situation. Or if something just happened, if you just lost your job or you just had a decrease in income, then we can potentially do a special circumstance appeal to see if the student qualifies for more need-based or federal aid. But if a student's not eligible for the financial aid appeal process, then admissions does have their appeal process as well. They normally require a statement, any other financial aid award letters you've received from other schools, and then normally within a couple weeks, they'll come back and let you know if you were able to receive additional, some people put it appeal money or, additional aid from appealing, and that aid is renewable. So if you receive additional aid from admissions, then it's renewable every year. I know there was a question about renewability of scholarships. Scholarships that McDaniel awards are renewable every year. Just the need-based and federal could change because you have to do the FAFSA every year. But outside scholarships, it really depends. Some of them are one-time only, and then others are renewable under certain conditions. So it's important that if a student received an outside scholarship, that you understand all all of the requirements. If the student has to maintain a certain GPA, if they have to give them an application, a renewal application every year or something like that. But for institutional aid, the student doesn't have to do anything. You just receive it every year for our merit scholarships.
Yeah, and for Richmond, you know, as long as you submit all of your required financial aid application materials by those 2 deadlines, depending on which admission decision you apply to. So early action and early decision 1, November 15th, February 1st for the other 2, which is early decision 2 and regular decision. You should receive your financial aid offer with your admission decision or shortly thereafter. You'll be able to, they call it, I think, the student spider portal, where they can log in and they'll be able to see what items they're missing from an admission standpoint, but also financial aid as well. And you'll receive emails from our office as well if you're missing a certain document or a piece. Maybe the parent's tax return was submitted and it looks like the student, they marked that they filed, but they haven't submitted their tax return yet, something like that. So you'll receive missing information emails from us. Your advisor might actually personally reach out as well if they have like questions about certain things or need a piece of documentation to verify something. So you'll receive a lot of communication. So if you don't receive your financial aid award with your admission decision, you should hopefully receive it shortly thereafter. If you didn't, you can always contact us and let us know when we will be sending them, or to make sure that your application is considered complete and it's ready, you know, to be reviewed and awarded. And you know, there was another piece to the additional funding. Yeah, that was kind of already, our process is very similar with the professional judgment. And yeah, I just always recommend that families reach out to the offices, like financial aid offices, to explain the situation, because the CSS profile for schools that have the CSS profile application, there is a special circumstances situation. But if you think about just kind of the sheer volume of applications that come into different colleges and universities, a lot of people fill out the special circumstances section, and it's not always something that would qualify for a reevaluation of financial aid. So, you know, maybe some financial aid officers and advisors, if they have the time, will take the time to reach out to the family to say, hey, I noticed you reported something. But that's not always the case, and I wouldn't rely on that. I would like advocate for yourself, reach out to the school's financial aid office and ask them what their process is. Like, what do you need? Is there documentation you need to verify stuff? What does that process look like? And just have a conversation with them, because that's probably a lot. You'll get a quicker turnaround probably.
Thank you. And then we know that you guys can't copy the information inside the chat, so we'll make sure to copy it and we'll send it out to parents along with the recording. I think that may have been the last question.
Thank y'all so much. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Aza. Thank you, Mr. Burrows, Terry. Thank y'all parents for coming. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Chat and Chew. The next email that you will receive from us, it will be the recording and the links. So let me